The cry of Trump's law and order as solution to centuries of anti-blackness, militarized police state, and systemic racism is actually nothing new within the landscape of Republican and GOP rhetoric and power play strategies to sustain possessive investments in whiteness. Quote-unquote law and order as a response to racial justice and civil rights activism towards those of us determined to fight systemic and institutional oppression is the playbook that former President Richard Nixon used to deal with civil disobedience from black people in the USA and their allies that were protesting the violence of racism that secured the power and privilege of white elite like Nixon, as well as Donald Trump's immigrant grandfather. Quote-unquote law and order essentially means that the best way to deal with those opposed to their own oppression is to criminalize them, to tell them that they are the reason that society has problems of unrest, that they are being divisive. Now, one does not have to search too far back in history to see images of black people being subjected to law and order while they peacefully protest. The hoses, the dogs, the beatings, the killings, batons crushing skulls, bodies being thrown into jail and tortured. Mainstream media's left outlets has paid attention to the supposed and obvious. Bigots and overt racists, Islamophobes, and xenophobes who were shown to collectively be white and working to lower middle class supporters of Trump. What is missing from the narrative is that one need not be a staunch Trump supporter to invoke law and order mentality, whether it is in policy or even in a social space or in one's household. One need not be a Nazi or a KKK sympathizer to support the quote-unquote building of walls, whether it be physically or epistemologically. And one need not be a supporter of Steve Bannon to suggest that non-whites interrogating and seeking to decenter and dismantle white supremacy are divisive, white-hating, or crossing borders. All of these phenomena are not relegated to the realm of Trump or the GOP. They can operate in the most well-intended spaces by mostly white and or financially privileged people who are passionate about ethical consumption and agriculture, who would quiver at the notion of being compared to Trump or the GOP in principle and ethics, yet have their own unique possessive investment in whiteness. Even though I've started off talking about Trump, this talk isn't going to really be about Trump as much as it will be about the red flags I've observed during the past 10 years of my scholarship and activism. This past decade has shown how Trump's win was the logical outcome that reflects how race and possessive investment in whiteness in a neoliberal capitalist era continue to matter in not just politics, but all aspects of life in the USA, including the ethical foodscape, if one just knows how to read the signs. First of all, what is a foodscape? Foodscape is an innovative concept to emphasize the spatialization of foodways and the interconnections between people, food, and places. Foodscape, drawn from landscape, is a term used to describe a process of viewing place in which food is used as a lens to bring into focus selected human relations. Such human relations are broad, but I'm incredibly interested in how living in a white racial caste system dictated by systemic racism, anti-blackness, and quote-unquote whiteness as the norm, as well as decolonization and anti-racism, operate and manifest within the ethical foodscape, i.e. vegan cultural spaces, locavore meetups, Afrocentric food healing centers, social media dedicated to ethical consumption, to name a few. I interrogate these relationships within the ethical foodscape, primarily through Black feminist and critical race materialist frameworks. So as a critical race materialist, I am someone who's interested in the meaning of objects, primarily food objects and what they can tell us about the racial power dynamics in the United States. Black feminist theory aims to deconstruct the impact of race and gender on the lives of Black women and girls. However, because race and gender do not exist in a vacuum, Black feminist theory is intersectional by showing that sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, motherhood, and region, to name a few, are affected by and do affect how Black women and girls experience their racial gender lives. U.S. Black feminist thought as specialized thought reflects the distinctive themes of African American women's experiences. Black feminist thought's core themes of work, family, sexual politics, motherhood, and political activism rely on paradigms that emphasize the importance of intersecting oppressions in shaping the U.S. matrix of domination. But expressing these themes and paradigms has not been easy because Black women have had to struggle against white male interpretations of the world, end quote. And that's from the book Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins. Another key focus of Black feminist theory is resistance to inequality from racist and sexist legacies of the antebellum slave system in the Americas. Katie Cannon defines such legacies as the racist, classist, and sexist interactions with the racial status quo, collectively experienced by Black women and girls. Cannon observes, quote, throughout the history of the United States, the interrelationship of white supremacy and male superiority has characterized the Black woman's reality as a situation of struggle, a struggle to survive in two contradictory worlds simultaneously, one white, privileged, and oppressive, the other Black, exploited, and oppressed, end quote. Black feminist theory helped me map out Foodscapes, starting with antebellum slavery in the USA. After all, a significant number of white men's wealth and power were direct products of capital gained from the unethical foodscape of enslaved Africans who harvested the land, who cooked for the slave master's family, and who even nursed the babies of white slave masters. In a post-2000 era, the expectation that Black people be submissive and exploited for possessive investment in whiteness / keeping civilized whiteness center continues to operate within the USA. Paula Deen isn't the only one who has exploited the white imagination of Black people from a bygone era within the foodscape. The use of Black people as quote-unquote props to tell a story of civilized whiteness within the ethical foodscape is frequent. It may not manifest in the strikingly racist way that it does through Paula Deen, but it is there nonetheless. Since 2005, I have consciously integrated critical race and Black feminist analysis into my burgeoning interest in food and ethics. This critical race and integrated approach would show me how racialization, racism, anti-Blackness, post-raciality, and whiteness operated amongst those who consider themselves quote-unquote good whites and ethical. Good and ethical because of their dedication to the rights and alleviation of suffering of non-human animals through their practice of veganism, mainly through the consumption of ethical food and other vegan non-edible products. Even though veganism is more than about eating vegan foods, it is through consumption of food that a majority of vegans centralize their praxis. Other forms of vegan praxis are abstaining from wearing clothing and shoes derived from animals, not going to the zoo and aquarium, and protesting against the use of non-human animals for medical experimentation. As I turn back to the last 2 years of Trump's, the momentum that he gained in his ultimate win, I think about the thousands of people convinced that white middle America's job insecurity was the fault of the non-white other. Coded language is powerful in creating racial meanings. One does not have to use the N-word anymore to conjure up fear, anxiety, or paint non-whites paint non-whites such as Black people as quote-unquote uncivilized or scary. Terms such as crack baby and now recently thug do the job perfectly well. We hear Trump constantly talking about immigrants, but he knows that his supporters don't hear the Merriam Dictionary definition of immigrant, which is void of racial and ethnic meaning. Trump knows immigrant can evoke the images of non-white people flooding across USA's borders to disrupt what is supposed to be only a land for white people. The dangers of racially coded language is that it constantly goes unchecked by many who consider themselves good whites who would rather be perceived as quote-unquote not racist than to actually engage in real praxis around dismantling systemic racism and divesting in their investment in whiteness that they often aren't truly conscious of. So we're going to talk about Flood Kitchen. At the beginning of October 2014, news was firing around in my Facebook circle that the popular blog Flood Kitchen had just released a cookbook. However, that was not a surprise, as it is not uncommon for outrageously popular culinary bloggers to find themselves with a lucrative book deal. What had my social media apps on fire was the news that the identities of the authors were not a couple of Black men who were from the hood and experienced the thug life. The authors of Flood Kitchen were a white LA couple. When asked why the Flood Kitchen creators hid their identities for so long, Matthew Holloway, one of the co-founders of the Flood Kitchen blog and writer of the book, responded that it was racist that the question was even asked of the author's skin color. The response sent a ripple through the Vegans of Color groups on Facebook. Immediately, the members of Vegans of Color collectively found the defensive answer and dishonesty of hiding their identities for so long, entrenched in cultural appropriation of the word and experience of thug. A significant number of Vegans of Color began to mobilize via the internet and created an anti-racist Vegans of Color group. The function of the group was to organize to protest the Thug Kitchen book tour. Critical race philosopher George Yancey has argued for years that one need not be consciously racist to still have deeply somatic fear of black men and boys in public space. As a matter of fact, many times it is disconscious racism and somatic fear that drives preemptive strikes against black people envisioned as dangerous thugs by white institutions, white-dominated districts, and white communities. Thug Kitchen and Vegans of Color protest is a microcosm that reflects the current racial climate in the USA. The book's supporters and post-racial comments by a significant number of mostly white people says a lot. It says, I don't have the trauma of racialized and state violence against my body that black people do and other racial minorities do. It says, why should I care about the word thug and the racially violent history and recent events that trails behind it? It says, as a matter of fact, I don't even have to realize that the term has been racialized and used against murder victims such as Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin to justify their deaths. In October of 2014, when I searched for the books with thug in the title on Amazon.com, over 100 books came up. 90% depicted black characters, and they were on the cover and focused on black urban life. Most novels from urban lit genre, it was obvious to me that the connotation is quote-unquote thug, and thug is connotated with black, urban, and gangsta. And it reflects the embodied experiences and perspectives from people who identify as black and urban from the hood. It was obvious that this is how the Thug Kitchen authors were using the word. Also, when I typed in thug in the Google search engine, the most popular information that came up was Tupac's Thug Life. Tupac wrote about what he meant when he refers to thug life, quote, commonly mistaken for a criminal, thug life is the opposite of someone having all he needs to succeed. Thug life is when you have nothing and succeed, when you have overcome all obstacles to reach your aim, end quote. In 1994, an interview with Tupac sheds more light on how he is invoking the term thug life, quote, my mother was a woman, a black woman, a single mother raising 2 kids on her own. She was dark-skinned, had short hair, got no love from nobody except for a group called the Black Panthers. I don't consider myself to be straight militant. I'm a thug, and my definition of thug comes from half of the street element and half of the Panther element, half of the independence movement, saying we will want self-determination. We want to do it by self-defense and by any means necessary. That came from my family, and that's what thug life is. It's a mixture, end quote. Tupac is talking about the Black Panthers and reality of street life. In this sense, Thug Kitchen authors have appropriated the word and experience of thug life. They have relied on the white supremacist imagination of what thug means. Tupac even talks about how mainstream media had made him and thug negative, as black men who use profanity and do not have much depth or intelligence. Ultimately, Thug Kitchen is a minstrel show of foul-mouthed black people who, even when given the chance to create a vegan cookbook, would put in foul language after every other recipe ingredient. There wouldn't be any of the depth of understanding of Tupac's embodied knowledge of the thug life. The Holloway and Davis's appropriation of the word thug becomes problematic because it not only erases the significance of Tupac's thug life essence, it becomes a mockery via how a white LA pro-vegan couple thinks or imagines how inner-city black people from the hood will communicate culinary ideas around veganism and healthy eating. When Tupac talks about obstacles to achieving a healthy and economically stable life, he's talking about factors such as environmental racism, food apartheid, racial profiling, lack of adequate healthy living resources, etc. All factors that would affect the ease of going vegan and making holistic and healthy meals that are in Thug Kitchen cookbook. For those mostly white people defending Thug and the project, having absolutely no racist impact, it is a scary implication of how most white people with good intentions do not know how systemic racism and white supremacy actually operate, do not know how to be real anti-racist. They are in fact non-racist, which is a neutral stance that allows racism and white supremacy to continue being the center ideology of the USA's moral fabric, political system, health system, food system, etc. Thug Kitchen blog and book do not address the lack of easy access to healthy and holistic food life that one finds in geographies of thug life that Tupac comes from. Such geographies can also be referred to as what geographer Neil Smith calls uneven geographies. Critical race geographers such as McKittrick, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and Clyde Woods have added a racial component to this concept of uneven geographies. Such a racialized component shows the social and economic devastation, the ongoing consequences of neocolonialism fused with white supremacist-based neoliberal capitalist system have caused within brown and black communities throughout the USA. For Tupac, the strategy in using the words and concept of thug life is political and consciousness raising, a way to encompass a specific black epistemology within white settler nations like the USA. The mainstream vegan cultural foodscape, such as Thug Kitchen, had its borders crossed and challenged, and it was clearly not liked. 10 years after my initial call for papers for Sistah Vegan, I decided to respond to the largely white vegan world's lack of literacy and compassion around Ferguson and the continuum of black liberation through Black Lives Matter by organizing a Vegan Praxis of Black Lives Matter conference for the spring of 2015. And of course, just like 10 years earlier, my mention of interrogating how living in a white settler nation affects the ethical foodscape was conveniently misunderstood by mostly white-identified vegans as being quote-unquote divisive. Don't get me wrong, there were also quite a few white vegans who supported the idea. To respond to the micro to macro-aggressive responses to the organizing of this vegan Black Lives Matter conference, I wrote this letter on 2015 and posted it to my blog. Titled, Dare Post-Racial White Vegans, All Lives Matter is a Racial Microaggression, Contributing to Our Daily Struggle with Racial Battle Fatigue. It reads as follows, quote, Dare Post-Racial White Vegans. This is not the first time I've had to sit down and write a letter to the collectivity of you who continue to be post-racial and post-human, yet benefit from systemic racism and white supremacy, while simultaneously making claims like, stop playing the race card, or I don't see race. Most recently, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I have gotten a significant number of white vegans responding to the theme of my conference with Everyone Matters, or All Lives Matter. The theme of the 2015 conference is the vegan praxis of Black Lives Matter, challenging neoliberal whiteness while building anti-racist solidarity among vegans of colors and allies. And for some reason, this upsets some of you. Maybe you don't know it, but saying things like all lives matter or everyone matters are actually called racial microaggressions and really don't help with our collective struggle with racial battle fatigue. Please revisit this concept of ahimsa and extend it to all human animals as well, and not get so defensive when a black feminist vegan scholar with a doctorate in critical studies of food and race organizes a vegan conference with Black Lives Matter in the title. When you say all lives matter, what you most likely mean is the following. Well, what about me? My whiteness is reality and has always been center, but I have been disconsciously aware of its racist implications until now. Since Black Lives Matter has infiltrated my Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr worlds, my unacknowledged privilege, my unacknowledged white socio-spatial epistemological narrative of the world, and my addiction to neoliberalism have all been called out. Revealed is that I literally am in collusion with maintaining economies of whiteness, systemic racism, neoliberalism, anti-blackness. Okay, I'll try not to panic, try to breathe and not appear too nervous. I'll just keep on saying all lives matter or everyone matters so I can shift the lens back onto me, pretending to show I'm in solidarity with all suffering beings and that I'm beyond race since I know we all suffer, even us white people. Trying to breathe, not appear too nervous, internal monologue. Wow, who knew that giving up my specious privilege would be far easier than actively dismantling systemic racism and white supremacy? Giving up my organic eggs for tofu scramble, leather car seats for pleather seats, and cow milk for soy milk are way easier than dealing with the implications of Black Lives Matter on my comfortable white embodied experience. So that's me trying to say what they're actually saying collectively. And I say, so I offer you this. Instead of responding with all lives matter or everyone matters, I invite you to participate in the online Sistah Vegan conference, April 24th through 25th, 2015. This will be a mindful space in which all can learn about how Black Lives Matter enhances vegan praxis and does not play the race card or distract from non-human animal suffering, end quote. 10 months later, during the fall of 2015, a famous white, wealthy, and cisgender man professor of ethics and vegan abolitionism had me on his radar after he had gotten into a debate with a vegan feminist. She had referenced my work in a debate with him, and since then, this professor had decided to show whomever would listen to or read his works that my work is quote-unquote white-hating and ensconced in bigotry. He was able to gather an army of what I read as mostly white vegans to get on board with the idea that my work, as well as the work of a handful of other non-white anti-racist vegan scholars, is quote-unquote white-hating. It was clear that this camp sincerely thought our scholarship equated to attacking individual white people for simply having white skin. Dismissed or misunderstood was that we were interrogating the consequences of a racial caste system in which white supremacy and capitalism dictated the logics and ethics of such a system. It was with this experience that I was acquainted with Dr. D'Angelo's concept of white fragility, though I prefer the term white rage, to name the decades of this behavior that I had dealt with. So white fragility basically is, it's when collectively, when white people who really think that they aren't racist or race doesn't matter, when they're confronted with the fact that race does matter. And there's different types of responses. There's aggression, there's dismissal, there's denial, there's shifting it to blaming something else, but there's no real engagement that systemic racism actually exists. And this can manifest in many different ways. A lot of it, the white fragility that D'Angelo focuses on is that, oh no, you accuse me as racist, as a white person, so I'm gonna start crying, it's just so emotionally difficult. So it centers back on white emotions versus actually shifting and becoming a really anti-racist activist. Because if the only thing that's happening is that your emotions are hurt, then you're pretty privileged, versus the actual pain and violence and suffering that people of color are going through. So white fragility kind of tries to, distract and focus on the fact that, oh, you hurt my emotions as a white person, trying to implicate me in this systemically racist society. So, I say, let's face it, their rage and response was about those like me preventing veganism from being great / white and masculinist again. This was also indicative of the white thug kitchen camps who refused to consider thug as a racially coded word. This was indicative of the plethora of white vegans who responded negatively to Sistah and the Sistah Vegan Project. And lastly, this is indicative of the white-identified vegans who could not extend their compassion to Michael Brown over a cigar. They and many like them have similar responses that reflects Trump's methodology when dealing with quote-unquote racial relations. A significant number do not desire to build bridges or step away from the center, since it actually means they will no longer have the epistemic power to define a central moral and ethical system that would allow them to maintain the racial privileges they have collectively had since the inception of USA's racial caste system. I am confident that most of these good white vegans who misconstrue my intentions will probably be against Trump's wall on the Mexico border. Yet their framing of how veganism should be builds epistemic walls that manifest into reality with real political, economic, and material consequences. They enact their own methods of quote-unquote law and order. In terms of possessive investment in whiteness, Lipset speaks of quote-unquote property. And veganism is an epistemology that has become intellectual property that needs to be protected by this mainstream. What would happen if the plethora of multi-million-dollar funded, post-racial, white-led vegan and animal rights organizations declared a shift of their goals to decentering white neoliberal framing and ethics? They would probably lose their top donors who are largely white and elite, who have minimal interest in letting go of their white privilege, but can easily invest in letting go of their specious privileges. Remember, white fragility and white rage is about the fear of loss of monetary power. A possessive investment in whiteness is about monetary resources. For many people of color in this white settler nation, vegan or not, the consequences of white rage also produce something called racial battle fatigue. So this is the last section I'm going to be talking about. It's called Racial Battle Fatigue, Reconstruction, and Freedom. So, in his paper, Racial Battle Fatigue was coined by Dr. William Smith of the University of Utah. In his paper, Challenging Racial Battle Fatigue, Smith explains racial battle fatigue as acts of, quote, racial microaggressions that can be defined as subtle, stunning, cumulative, verbal, and nonverbal insults layered with racism, sexism, elitism, and other subordination. Every day, people of color are faced with interpreting the subtleties of microaggressions, deciphering the layers of discrimination included in the insults, and deciding whether or not to respond. Dr. Smith argued that the amount of emotional stress on people of color caused by microaggressions to uphold white supremacist structuring of society is similar to the trauma and stress experienced by soldiers in war. Yes, I've been doing intersectional anti-racism work within the realm of ethical foodscapes for over a decade, and I too have struggled with racial battle fatigue. I've mentored so many people of color, mostly vegan, on how to take care of their spiritual, mental, and physical health. Yes, white allies also do experience racial battle fatigue in varying forms, but I do specifically focus on people of color. And I talk about the importance of taking care of ourselves while we're doing this particular intersectional activist work. And the focus that I'm very concerned about is mental health and getting therapy when we need it, but because we live in a society in which access to therapy is predicated upon either financial wealth or having access to health insurance that covers it, a lot of us don't get what we need. So it's really difficult, even if you have that, to find a therapist that understands how racism is a trauma that needs to be dealt with, and very, very few are trained in that. One of the other things that I do suggest for people of color like myself doing this type of work is that you should not be educating anybody for free or feel compelled to do it. So it's a lot of mental work to constantly educate mostly white people about systemic racism and that it exists. And you don't get paid for it, and a lot of us become very sick or just not very well. And we have nothing, to really support us through that. So I advise for a lot of people, just don't educate people for free. It's not necessarily your job.